The typical narrative of Roman history that has emerged in popular imagination is that the wise Nerva, who represented the Senate faction, ended the tyranny of Domitian and adopted Trajan based on merit alone. Some ancient sources do tell us that Nerva showed his wisdom by adopting Trajan and subsequently don't indicate that the choice was forced in any way. This was perhaps the basis for Nerva's continued positive reputation hundreds of years later. 4th century historians like Eutropius and Aurelius Victor echo this idea. The coin on the right hand side of the screen shows that this was also the official story promoted by Trajan. However, a closer look at more contemporary sources may show us that the situation was significantly more complicated, as is usually the case in Roman history. In order to truly understand the adoption of Trajan, we must spend some time in the previous decades to understand Nerva's ancestry and its interactions with previous emperors. We know from a reference in Seneca's work, written to Nero on the subject of clemency, that Nerva's great-grandfather was a close confidant of Augustus and had previously belonged to the court of Mark Antony. According to Tacitus, Nerva's grandfather was a close friend of the Emperor Tiberius, and Tiberius was greatly aggrieved by his suicide. As for Nerva's father, less is known about him, but he did hold a suffect consulship under the Emperor Caligula. This shows that Nerva's ancestors, all called Marcus Cocceius Nerva, were always close to the reigning emperors, even somewhat tyrannical ones. And when Nerva himself entered politics, he takes up the same role. Tacitus tells us that Nerva was highly esteemed by Nero for some role he played in the uncovering or in the fallout of the Pisonian conspiracy. Nero appreciated whatever Nerva had done to such an extent that Nerva received triumphal honours, and sculptures of Nerva were placed in the palace. Furthermore, some epigrams of Martial indicate that Nerva was associated with the production and critique of Nero's poetry. This indicates a close personal relationship. In addition, Nerva was linked to the Julio-Claudian dynasty through a series of marriages. Furthermore, study of Nerva has shown that he may have been related to the usurper Otho via marriage, and as a result, may have had a direct familial connection to the throne. What would have initially been a great opportunity for Nerva would have quickly turned sour, as Otho was defeated by Vitellius. There may be an insight here into Nerva's first interaction with the Flavian dynasty. Sensing the danger posed to him by Vitellius, Nerva may have allied himself and his circle with Vespasian and acted on Vespasian's behalf. This theory nicely explains why Nerva gains his first consulship, shared with Vespasian, 1 year after the events of the Year of the Four Emperors. Nerva appears to have enjoyed continued success under the Flavians. His next big break occurs following a revolt against Domitian in the year 89. This military revolt was led by Saturninus, the governor of Germania Superior, and he was supported by the legions under his command. The revolt was crushed by 2 nearby governors, Lapius Maximus and Norbanus, who are erroneously combined into one person by the writer of the Epitome de Caesaribus. Trajan, who was a legatus in Hispania at the time, also contributed to ending the revolt, and Pliny recalls this event in his Panegyricus. We can see how Domitian rewarded those who were loyal to him in the fallout of this revolt. Nerva is immediately rewarded the consulship of the year 90, a strong indication of his loyalty to Domitian, as Domitian needed to assert control and steady the ship of his regime. Trajan is awarded the consulship the year after, and Pliny notes that Trajan was awarded the privilege of leading various campaigns. The careers of Maximus and Norbanus also progressed, with Maximus being granted a second suffect consulship in 95, and Norbanus being given the post of Praetorian prefect around 94. These events, and Nerva and Trajan's role in them, show that far from quietly biding their time outside of Domitian's sphere, both of these men were close to Domitian and thought by him to be very loyal. Furthermore, Nerva and his ancestors were consistently close to reigning emperors, indicating that they were hardly champions of the Senate or republican values. One thing we can definitely credit Nerva and his ancestors for is their shrewdness and ability to survive tumultuous imperial events. Next, we must discuss Domitian's assassination in September of the year 96. There has long been an idea that this assassination was senatorial in nature, yet the sources do not point to this. The assassination was in fact conceived by members of Domitian's immediate household, notably his chamberlain Parthenius. Dio states that Domitian's wife Domitilla and the Praetorian prefects Petronius and Norbanus were aware of this plot. This is the same Norbanus who aided in the crushing of the revolt of Saturninus. Dio qualifies this statement by stating that this account is a tradition. Suetonius' account doesn't mention the Praetorian prefects and offers slightly different names. However, both sources agree that Parthenius and other members of Domitian's household were behind the plan and execution of the plot. Dio tells us how the plotters, by nature of their station, did not have anybody on hand to replace Domitian, and before carrying out the killing, had in fact asked several people to replace Domitian before Nerva agreed. All of this does prompt the question, why did Domitian's court suddenly decide to betray him? Domitian was known for being paranoid, and anyone close to him had to greatly earn his trust. It is possible that a spate of executions late in Domitian's reign are responsible for the panic and fear that was instilled in his inner circle. Domitian's ruthless paranoia was elevated to such an extent in his later years that even immediate family members and his close advisors were no longer safe. Figures as prominent as Titus Flavius Clemens were killed. Clemens was married to Domitian's niece Domitilla. He was consul for the year 95, and his sons, named Titus and Domitian, were designated as successors. Clemens was reportedly killed on the dubious charge of atheism. Glabrio, the man who shared the consulship with Trajan, was also killed. Nero's freedman, Epaphroditus, who was loyal to Nero until the end and assisted his suicide, was also killed by Domitian for the very act of assisting Nero in his death. This retroactive, bizarre and paradoxical action by Domitian, the killing of a loyal member of a former emperor's household, may have seriously worried members of Domitian's own household. The takeaway from all this is that this was certainly a conspiracy and coup of the palace, and not the Senate. In addition, one can speculate that the conspirators may have chosen Nerva precisely for the fact he was a concerned member of Domitian's inner circle who was of senatorial rank, rather than any special allegiance that Nerva had to the Senate. Due to this, one can imagine that perhaps the conspirators themselves identified Nerva as a possible bridge between the pro-Domitian factions that dominated the military and the mostly anti-Domitian Senate. Perhaps they were also aware of Nerva and his ancestors' shrewdness and ability to survive and navigate chaos. It is also worth noting that it is not a true reflection of things to split the power blocks into neatly defined pro-Domitian or anti-Domitian columns. There were senators favourable to Domitian and generals opposed to him too. Generalisations like this mostly paint a general trend rather than a strict rule, and are most helpful in the process of narrative crafting. Suetonius makes use of this technique by demarcating clear power blocks in his account of the aftermath of Domitian's assassination. He states a marked contrast between soldiers and senators. The Praetorian Guard were furious and called for the deification of Domitian and the execution of the plotters. Suetonius tells us earlier in the work that Domitian increased the soldiers' pay by a third, hence their love for him. Suetonius says that the Praetorians lacked leaders at this time. Were the prefects in on the plot like Dio states, and were the guard calling for the execution of their own prefects? The senators, on the other hand, were overjoyed and earnestly began the process of damning Domitian's memory. Suetonius also tells us that the common person was rather indifferent to the whole business. They, after all, hadn't been exposed directly to Domitian's harshness like the upper classes were. The often inaccurate account of Aurelius Victor alludes to an agreement that the Praetorians came to with the nobility. Perhaps this is a reference to the donative the Praetorians received that is indicated on a coin issue from the beginning of Nerva's reign. Trouble from the soldiers did not merely come from the guard in the capital. A story in Philostratos' work, Lives of the Sophists, indicates that the soldiers on the Danube were very close to mutiny and would have outright rebelled if not for the entreaties of Dio Chrysostomos. Dio Chrysostomos later became a close friend of Nerva and even took his family name, Cocceius. Dio was in the vicinity of the Danube due to embarking on an adventurous exile following the execution of one of his notable friends by Domitian. Nerva was aware of the potential trouble from the armies from the very beginning of his reign, hence his coinage references harmony with them and contains the striking image of shaking hands. Some of these issues also contain a prow and legionary standard. These designs were amongst Nerva's very first coin issues as emperor and continued throughout his reign. Nerva's reign was initially very busy. There was a wave of killings of those who had acted as Domitian's informers. Those exiled by Domitian were recalled, treason trials were stopped, and those of a lower rank were no longer allowed to lodge complaints against their superiors. This restoration of order and justice may be what the Justitia coin issues wish to communicate. The restoration of freedom or libertas granted to the senators in this period was intentional, but it perhaps went too far, and numerous senators began accusing one another of all kinds of wrongdoing which led to political chaos. Pliny himself, in one of his letters, explains the situation and records how he also used this opportunity to accuse someone before the Senate. Economically, Nerva depleted the imperial treasury by returning property that had been confiscated by Domitian. Nerva abolished various taxes and gave out gifts to the poor. As a result, he had to cut back in other areas, such as games and festivities, and also sold much personal and imperial property. Nerva swore that he would heed the advice of leading men and not execute any senators. Dio reports that they were senatorial plots against Nerva, making this latter step particularly brave. On screen now is some coins of Nerva promoting some of these economic reforms mentioned previously. We can see how Nerva worked hard to placate multiple power blocks, and there is an implication here that he perhaps didn't have any of them on his side by default. Dio tells us that senators were plotting against him, and further names another plotter by name, and this name is corroborated by the epitome de Caesaribus. Calpurnius Crassus was suffect consul under Domitian, and during Nerva's reign he reportedly tried to stir up the Praetorians to rebel, and was exiled for this attempt. Perhaps the Senate didn't so much love the presence of Nerva as much as the absence of Domitian. Pliny's letter to Quadratus details the potential for trouble from a general and his legions stationed in the east, about whom serious rumours were reportedly circulating. The identity of this man is debated, as is the exact nature of the rumours. However, one can't help but think of usurpation. After some months, tensions had not simmered, and this culminated in the famous palace revolt by the Praetorians in the year 97. Pliny's Panegyricus famously refers to this event as the Great Blot on our age, and tells us most clearly what happened to Nerva. He was besieged, arrested, and confined by the guard. The epitome de Caesaribus provides some extra details for us. It appears that there were more calls from the soldiers demanding the execution of those involved in Domitian's assassination during this time. This greatly concerned Nerva, yet he stoutly resisted these demands. Nerva was therefore unceremoniously restrained and ignored, and those responsible for Domitian's assassination were brutally killed. Nerva was then forced to commend the actions of the mutineers. Some investigation of the characters involved is necessary here. Aelianus, who led the revolt, was previously holder of the Praetorian prefecture under Domitian, but not during the assassination. The epitome de Caesaribus names two men brutally killed during the revolt: Parthenius, the chief conspirator and Domitian's chamberlain, and Petronius, one of Domitian's Praetorian prefects at the time of his assassination, who continued in this post into Nerva's reign. If Aelianus was loyal to Domitian, how could he ever be expected to peacefully serve alongside Petronius? Was Aelianus promoted for other reasons, and then found some other motivation to rebel? The discussion of Aelianus' motivations, and who may have been behind them, one suspect being Trajan, is discussed in the papers shown on screen. They also discuss how these events and Aelianus may relate to the mysterious man in the east, and how this mysterious man may have been either a rival or a supporter of Trajan. Furthermore, these papers, and the other papers shown on screen previously, greatly informed this video, and are excellent reads if you want more information. Anyway, back to the assassination. What about Norbanus, the other Praetorian prefect that Dio names as aware of the plot against Domitian? He disappears from the historical record in the year of the assassination. Why was he removed, but Petronius was allowed to stay in post? Was Norbanus in fact too loyal to Domitian, and not aware of the plot? He had in fact quashed the rebellion of Saturninus after all. Perhaps he was also killed, removed or exiled at the time of Domitian's assassination, or maybe plain old natural causes happened to get him, before the Praetorians could. Regardless of all this, both Dio and the epitome de Caesaribus link Nerva's imprisonment directly with the adoption of Trajan. As a result, it does seem difficult to imagine that the adoption of Trajan was the free choice of Nerva, who a short time before declaring the adoption was imprisoned by the guard. Instead, a more likely reconstruction is that Nerva, having been close to Domitian but also lacking military experience, was plagued by numerous disloyal factions that had reasons to oppose him and constantly threatened civil strife. Ultimately, Nerva failed to navigate the interests of these various groups as long as he remained emperor, and had to concede the role to someone else. As a result, Nerva adopted Trajan as his successor, a military man, apparently loyal to Domitian, who aided in dealing with the revolt of Saturninus. This placated the guard and the army, the groups that caused the most trouble for Nerva. It is worth noting here that there were people more militarily accomplished than Trajan, including Maternus, the man who in my opinion is most likely the mysterious general in the east. However, as we will see, Trajan's family was closely connected with the Flavians, and furthermore, the loyalty of the Rhine legions, which Trajan could provide due to his governorships in the area, was paramount to Rome's security. Pliny's Panegyricus gives us a clear insight into the reality of the situation at the start of Nerva's reign, although it is a possible exaggeration, owing to the fact that it was a speech of praise and gratitude from Pliny to Trajan after Pliny received the suffect consulship in the year 100. Pliny makes clear how dire the situation was under Nerva, and hails Trajan as the saviour of the empire. Pliny hints that Nerva had little agency in the matter, stating, perhaps euphemistically, the adoption was simply obedience to the gods. Once Trajan was adopted, Pliny recalls that all trouble apparently died away at once. Pliny also let slip that if Trajan wasn't adopted and someone else was instead, then there would have been more outbreaks of insurrection. This shows that although Nerva did indeed overlook family ties, as Dio stated and Pliny implied, there was no one related to Nerva who could solve the problem the way Trajan did. This wasn't a decision based on wisdom or merit, but based on the dynamics of power. The fact that Trajan was a Spaniard further showed that the military could not only make emperors, but could circumvent established norms when doing so. Pliny later highly praises how Trajan remained a loyal Caesar out on the provinces and did not attempt to seize power, despite sharing the title of Germanicus with Nerva in 97. Pliny also points out that Trajan had a loyal army and distinguished ancestry. This ancestry had deep connections to the Flavian dynasty. Trajan's father had married Marcia, the elder sister of Titus's second wife. Trajan's father had also been granted the suffect consulship by Vespasian and was appointed to prestigious posts under him. Pliny perhaps states the real reason for Trajan's loyalty, when he states that Trajan was in fact the de facto emperor even before the death of Nerva. Even after Nerva's death and Trajan's elevation to Augustus, Trajan did not immediately hasten back to Rome. Instead, Trajan toured the military forces on the Rhine and Danube. Perhaps there was still stirrings of unrest among the troops that were crucial for Trajan to iron out. Domitian certainly cast a long shadow that extended even beyond Nerva's reign. Some speculate this shadow reached all the way to Trajan's first Dacian war, and this was undertaken to placate these previously mutinous troops by continuing Domitian's war and providing the opportunity for glory under Trajan. An attempt to synthesize all this information is challenging and certainly defies any clear conclusions due to the murky and disconnected nature of our sources. However, I hope I have managed to communicate the complexity of the situation and the weakness of the traditional narrative. Hopefully this also aids in disproving the myth that Nerva instituted a formal system of adoption, which is nowhere stated in the sources. From the information presented, it seems Nerva was not as aligned to the Senate to the extent commonly believed, and Nerva and his family were regularly close advisors to emperors, some of them unsavoury. The assassination of Domitian was carried out by members of Domitian's own household, and Nerva was possibly chosen as emperor due to his ability to act as a conciliatory middleman between those favourable and opposed to Domitian. Ultimately, Nerva failed at this, perhaps inevitably. The way Nerva corrected this failure was to pass the role on to someone else before his ill health overtook him. Despite having little agency, he played the part dutifully, and out of the tumult, Rome found itself being ruled by one Marcus Vulpius Traianus, Optimus Princeps.